Lincoln's Law is what the False Claims Act case, False Claims Act itself is normally known as. Lincoln, it was passed in the Civil War because people at that era, with the communications that we had available to us, communication systems, people would do a contract for horses, and they would send mules, or they said spavined beasts, which I think means they were in pretty sad shape. They would send supposedly flour, and it would show up and it'd be infested with weevils. They sent uniforms that were made of like coffee filter material, not actual like paper, basically. And by the time the government got the goods, it was relayed back to the DC, that these were bad goods, though they were long gone. So it was very difficult to catch the fraudsters. So they specifically called it, it's actually not thief, it's set a rogue to catch a rogue, but set a thief to catch a thief. If you'll rat them out, we will give you a share of what we recover. And I say that to say most of my relators are not participating in the fraud. Some of them have, and they've had changes of heart, or their conscience has troubled them the whole time. But the first thing many defendants want to say is, well, he did it. It's like, it doesn't matter. That's the whole purpose of this statute in its very inception. It's based in English law, where people, where the king didn't always talk about bad communication. Back in the day, they didn't, it was by horseback. That was about the only thing they could manage. And so you would have people who knew about a problem where the crown was being robbed, taxes not being paid, fill in the blank, and they authorized people to bring a suit on behalf of the king and themselves, and then receive a bounty for it. So this is what it's modeled on. It's one of the very few, in fact, I think it's the only remaining Huitan statute in the United States. I don't know what they have left in England right now, and there is a current constitutional challenge going on to this. We settled it 20 years ago. I don't think that, I'm not worried, and we can talk about that if people have questions, but there is a constitutional challenge going on because it is really weird. You're basically bringing a lawsuit as a witness. I saw this happen, and I'm telling you to decide what you want to do about it. It went away pretty much. It happened during Lincoln's era in the 40s, when we had all of the war going, a little bit of war happening in the 40s, and as a result, the government was inundated with lawsuits that they already knew about. So they passed what became known as the government knowledge bar. If the government already knows about it, you're disqualified. And then they didn't really very well define that, and they pretty much killed the statute. It was reawakened in the 80s. I remember, as I was but a girl at the time, I assure you. But I remember the age of Reagan, we would hear about these $500 toilet seats and $60 hammers and all this nonsense. So as a reform on that, Chuck Grassley brought forth the amendments to the False Claims Act, and it exploded because first we had the typical kind of military procurement cases, but then people realized this is aimed at anybody who does contracting with the federal government, if they're defrauding the government through contract. So in the early 90s, we had the first cases aimed at Medicare, and that is a huge spend for the U.S., huge spend, our biggest spend by far. And once it was Medicare was brought under it, we were off to the races. And I've got a list of other statutes there, how it has been dealt with. It has, since that renaissance in the 80s, it's only been expanded. It's never been contracted, but it is a very volatile law. Like I said, we have a constitutional challenge right now. I don't think I've been practicing in this area for over 20 years. I will pause so that you can gasp and say impossible, impossible, Julie. But we've been, during that time, I don't think I've gone 2 years in a row that one of the three executive branches hasn't acted actively on my statute, making some of my cases better than they were and some of my cases dead. So it's a very unusual area of the law. And if you want to go to the next slide, I'll tell you while you do that this is why it keeps getting expanded. Since fiscal year 2010, annual recoveries have topped $2 billion every year. And this is basically found money coming back to the government. This year we had, in the past fiscal year, we had over 1,400 cases filed. That's the most that's ever been filed. Two reasons for that. One, I would like to say, is the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative that I promise we're going to get to in just a minute, but also PPP loans. and all of the CARES Act funding that was kind of sprayed out without any caution at all across the country. So that accounts for some of that coming up, but we had 2.9 billion recovered in 2024, and that's actually down a bit. And I've got the statistics there. 83% of that was from qui tam cases. And I want to give you a little inside baseball. People say qui tam, people say qui tam, people sometimes say tom, but that's only if you want to sound snooty. It's Latin. So just like you would say quid pro quo, not quid pro quo, it's a QU sound. So now you know, and you can correct people. So 83% of that came from qui tam cases, 57% from healthcare fraud. That's actually lower than in most years. 3% from defense procurement fraud. I'm hoping to see that number go up as we deal with these civil cyber fraud cases, and the remaining from other federal agencies. So let's go ahead to the next slide. Basically, the FCA is implicated if someone lies to the government to get money that they're not entitled to, which is submitting a false claim, is what it's called. Or if you lie to help someone else get money. So you could cause them to submit. So when a doctor tells a biller to load something into the billing system that's false, he's also guilty. He doesn't get away with it by saying, well, I didn't put it in there, she did. But that doesn't work. Or if you lie to keep money that you're not entitled to keep, then that's a reverse false claim, right? So if you lie so that you're not subject to a penalty that you would otherwise be subject to, then that's a reverse false claim. And the same thing goes if it doesn't matter if you personally click to go on the billing or the keep it. It's if you cause that submission, then you're liable for it. So you can see, go ahead and we'll go to the next slide. And you can see anyone who does this is liable to the government. This is straight out of the statute, for a civil penalty of not less than 500,000, 5,000 and not more than 10,000 as adjusted by the Inflation Act. And I'm going to pause there. Right now, that is per claim between $14,000 and $28,000 that you would be paying per claim. So that's every time you ask the government for money on that contract, which in a grant that has 4 drawdowns in once a year, maybe that's four claims where you lied. But in a situation where you're doing monthly billing, you're doing it once a month. If you're a doctor, you're doing that constantly. The penalties would far outstrip the damages. But then take a look at there. That's the basic what you're going to pay, and that's again if you lose at trial, plus 3 times the amount of damages the government sustains because of the act of that person. So note that it's treble damages, which is really statutorily consistent with the fact that a relator who brings the case can get up to 1/3 of the recovery themselves. So even if the relator's given, and again, we're talking about this is what happens if you lose at trial, then you're going to get, the government gets back 3 times, the relator can get up to 1 of those times, and the government is still getting double damages, and it's all coming out of the pockets of the bad guys, which I like. This raises 2 questions, or this raises a question for cybersecurity cases. What is the measure of the damage, right? So if I build a building out of Chinese steel, assuming there's such a thing, I'm not an expert on steel, but if I build that building out of non-American steel and I still got a building out of it, how have I been damaged? How are we going to evaluate the damage to that? And in the case of cyber security, the first thing a lot of people want to say when I speak is, well, we haven't had a breach. And to which, because I've been a Cyber Plus One for a long time, I say that I bet you don't have audit logs. And I'm almost always right. Maybe you haven't had a breach. Maybe you just don't know you don't have a breach because your cybersecurity is that poor. And what we're talking about is that one middle band on the wonderful chart that Scott showed us about CMMC. And then if you looked below that, it also referenced DFAR 7012, right? So the DFARs have been around a lot longer than the CMMC has. And just as a pause, for those of you who are involved, if you've been, I think CMMC involves a third-party audit, which means that the C-suite suddenly should be paying attention, right? When it came out that you would now be certifying your cybersecurity compliance with NIST 800-171 for covered defense information, your company started signing for that if you're doing business with the government January 1st, 2018, so about 7 years ago. You've been saying you're compliant. So yeah, there's CMMC, and if you're not CMMC compliant, meaning that you're not going to pass that CMMC test, you've been lying for 7 years. And that may have been an unknowing lie. And again, you got to know it. That may be your defense. I didn't know. But there is a concept of you should have known because I asked you, are you doing it? And you said yes, you signed. So the day for this was 7 years ago. And I stress that because CMMC's novelty has a lot of people kind of scrambling. And I think that leads to people then whining about not wanting to do the spend. But my friend, you've been saying this was already done. It needs to be a top priority. The civil money penalty, I have up there that it has been adjusted for inflation now, and it's mandatory if you lose at trial. And I've talked already kind of about what a claim is. So if we want to go on to the next slide, I'll tell you that's why a lot of these cases settle. Government typically tries to settle the cases on a double damages instead of a treble damages posture, and that ought to be very attractive to you if you're in a bad case. So this is considered generally military procurement fraud. This has generally been the cybersecurity cases we've had so far have been, now there have been 2 settled under personal health information or the sensitive data that we spent the first part of the program talking about. One, a contractor in Florida who was holding data for the Florida Medicaid equivalent, so children mostly, had the children's data. It was not even running on, it was on a end of life operating system, and needless to say, it was hacked. And all that data gotten out. And my husband likes to say the difference between security and privacy is you can restore security, but you can never restore privacy. Once a private information has gotten out, you're stuck, and that's the harm that we have to really focus on. Here, the military information, I'm not appreciative of the fact that if you don't have proper cybersecurity and you're doing government contracting, you're handing over what we've worked hard for to foreign threat actors. It's absolutely true. I should have put a slide in with a picture. Our F-22 is so much like the FJ in China that the error that was made in the coding of the pilot's canopy is replicated. Like, there is no question that was stolen and built. And I mean, if you are in this industry, you may know that already, right? But the government at large, the civil side of the fence, has been going, oh wait, this is bad, and hence we have CMMC. Hence we're seeing enforcement. And to that government knowledge thing, the government decided to make it very clear that this was material to its contracts and that you are expected to abide by it through the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative. So the bottom line is that DCIS is very focused on matters that affect the health, safety, welfare, and mission readiness of warfighters and combat units. So let's go to the next slide. And this is the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative. This was the day. It was momentous in my marriage. I always know. I got a call from Will. He's like, we're finally going to overlap. And I was like, impossible. But this is not going to be material. But Lisa Monaco in October announced that they're going to do the CCFI. The CCFI will combine their expertise in civil fraud enforcement and procurement and cybersecurity to combat these cyber threats. And we're going to use the FCA to pursue cybersecurity related fraud. And if you knew anything about what the FCA was, that was a bomb. If you didn't, and most cyber people do not, it didn't make nearly the splash that CMMC coming out did. So we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So there's the CCFI, and important safety tip. Brian Boynton identified 3 ways that you could violate the FCA under this, which would be knowing failure to comply with cybersecurity standards. That's just, you have a standard, you know it, you don't comply with it. You're on the hook, you've lied to the government. Knowing misrepresentation, that's telling the government you've done it. Now, most people think of the third one, you don't report a cyber incident. Well, yes, that's the case, but it doesn't have to go to that level. You may never have had a breach, and you're still liable under this statute, which is pretty kind of hard for people to get their head around, because they think, well, then what's your damage? But my friend, there's no damage provision, no element in the FCA of damages. Remember, you're going to be on the hook for those, at least those penalties. And we're trying to quantify what damage you may have done by not properly following